This is the Expert Series podcast from the CDA Institute, Canada's premier defense and security think tank. I'm Josh Malm, and it's Thursday, March 5th, 2026. You may have noticed that I have taken a hiatus from hosting our weekly podcast. I was on leave from the CDA Institute for about a month. I'm grateful that our CDAI fellow, Dr. David Boris, was able to step in and expertly host the podcast in my absence. We just put out a string of great episodes that I encourage you all to check out. On another note, David conducted some interviews for us today at our annual Ottawa Conference on Security and Defense, and we'll be releasing them as part of a new podcast next week. On a final note, before we get to this week's episode, I'd like to give a really big thanks to the invaluable efforts of our CDAI staff, Gabriella Calder, Carol Ann Leonard, Greg Colbert, Pauline Baudou, and Emmylou Surgeon for managing the production and coordination of the podcast during my time off, and for handling our communications as well. They learn quickly on the fly, and the whole CDAI team consistently does amazing work. Now, on to today's episode.
We were having negotiations with these lunatics, and it was my opinion that they were going to attack first. They were going to attack. If we didn't do it, they were going to attack first. I felt strongly
efforts to prevent Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon and to prevent its regime from further threatening international peace and security. Because Canada is taking the world as it is, not passively waiting for a world we wish to be.
Just last week, long-standing tensions between the United States, Israel, and Iran exploded into open conflict when the coordinated U.S.-Israeli military campaign targeted key Iranian military and government infrastructure, including a decisive airstrike that killed Iranian Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. Khamenei was one of the most powerful figures in the Middle East and the architect of Iran's political and regional strategy for over 3 decades. The assassination of Khamenei marks a dramatic turning point in the Middle East, raising urgent questions about Iran's internal stability, the trajectory of its nuclear program, and the widening conflict with Israel and the United States. Canada finds itself watching from a delicate vantage point, balancing its alliance with the United States against its own diplomatic principles and regional interests. To unpack the significance of the assassination, as well as the implications for regional and global security, we're joined once again by Dr. Thomas Juneau, professor at the University of Ottawa's Graduate School of Public and International Affairs. Dr. Juneau, it's wonderful to have you back on the podcast today. Thanks for joining us.
Great to be back.
So on February 28th, Iranian Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei was assassinated. Can you explain to us how he was identified, what this operation looked like, and could you touch on what his death spells for Iranian stability as well as the nuclear program?
Well, I think the first point that I'd mention is that to this day, I still do not understand what he was doing with a significant number of his closest advisors, military and others, in his compound, in his office, in a meeting room above ground, when there was serious speculation that the U.S. or Israel or both would attack at any point. That is a spectacular failure of operational security on his part that I still struggle to understand. For weeks and months, especially since last year, the June 2025 war, there had been a lot of rumors that he was spending some time, if not a lot of time, in bunkers, moving around, hard to reach, which made sense to some extent. So I still do not understand what he was doing. The impact is significant, but shouldn't be exaggerated. It's significant because as the supreme leader, he was the most powerful individual in Iran by far, and he had been in that position since 1989. And the system was really built by him for him. Not only the system inside Iran, but also in many ways, everything that we've said about the Islamic Republic's foreign policy, its support for terrorist and violent groups in the region, Hezbollah, the Houthis, etc. He built that in many ways. That being said, the Islamic Republic is a complicated system. It's a deeply institutionalized system. It is not a one-man show, as much as it was centered on his personality to a significant extent. So the Islamic Republic absolutely survives his death. It continues. It is weakened. It is, in fact, significantly weakened because not only him, but several other leaders have been killed. And as we are speaking, the Israeli and American war is continuously degrading their military capabilities, government infrastructure, and so on. But as of this week at least, the Islamic Republic is surviving, and I still do not see its fall as imminent, at least in the short term.
Well, last time we had you on the podcast to discuss Iran was actually, I think, August of 2024. So a little over a year ago now. Iran and Israel were engaged in what's been called a proxy conflict. The leader of Hamas had been assassinated. And earlier that year, President Raisi and members of his cabinet died in a helicopter crash. So flash forward to today, we've got the Trump 2.0, the second Trump administration. Of course, last week's assassination, which this episode is about. Do you think you could quickly maybe walk us through some of the major or key developments in that time frame and how we got to where we are now with this February 28th assassination?
So if I crunch in a quick answer, a lot of really important developments, really turning point is October 2023, when Hamas launches its terrorist attack on Israel. 1,200 are dead, 250 are taken hostages. This really changes everything. Until October 2023, there was a perception of a bit of a balance of terror between Israel, the U.S. on one side, Iran, and it's what we often call the axis of resistance on the other side. It was clear that Israel and the U.S. were more powerful, but because it was assumed that Iran and its partners had the ability to inflict significant pain on Israel, on the U.S., on their Arab partners like Saudi Arabia, that in practice there was a bit of a mutual deterrence, and that to avoid direct war, they would confront each other indirectly through proxies locally, but would avoid escalation. October 2023 is really a shock in Israel. It is a deep trauma, and again, to emphasize here, I'm describing and explaining what happened, not taking a side or justifying what either side has tried to do. Israel really rejects over the months that follow this notion of a perception of a balance of terror. And Israel steadily ramps up its attacks, not only on Hamas, significantly weakens the group, on Hezbollah in Lebanon throughout 24 and then 25, significantly weakens the group, not as much as Hamas, but significantly weakens it. And then in 2024, for the first time, first in April and then in October, we actually see direct military confrontation between Israel and Iran. That had not happened until then. These are limited confrontations. There's still a clear willingness on both sides not to escalate, but we do see in both instances that Israel dominates, that Israel has the ability to inflict much more pain on Iran, and that Israel can really limit and manage the pain that Iran inflicts. Fast forward to June 2025, things escalate even more, the 12-day war. Here again, there is a willingness somewhat on both sides not to escalate, especially on the U.S. and on the Iranian side, less so in Israel. But, the threshold is much lower. And Israel really inflicts even more pain on Iran, destroys a significant chunk of its air defenses in particular, and achieves partial control of its airspace. The U.S. joins in for limited strikes on Iran's nuclear program. So, the lesson from Israel's side is that balance of terror that had constrained Israel for years could be fully jettisoned. Was it a matter of time before things exploded as they are now? That's up for debate, but clearly it was a growing probability. It happens over the weekend, and Israel and the U.S. now are in full-out war against Iran. And as we are seeing now, they are inflicting massive damage on Iran, not only in terms of leadership decapitation, but also in terms of targeting military sites, air defenses, nuclear sites to some extent as well. But beyond that, they're also hitting a lot of the Iranian government's repressive capacity, police stations, law enforcement headquarters, and so on. Whereas Iran is lashing out. It is not constrained. It is not fearful of escalation anymore, because this is an existential war for the Islamic Republic. Its very survival is at stake. But what we're seeing is that its ability to inflict damage on Israel, on the U.S. and their Arab partners is actually limited. Iran is hurting them, but exponentially less than it is itself being hurt.
So, Dr. Juneau, do you have any idea how far this might escalate? And you touched on this in your opening comments, but on top of that, what would you say are the implications from this vantage point for Iranian stability internally and then regionally, and then maybe a step further globally?
So how far can this go is extremely unpredictable. And all of us are trying to figure out what is the end game. And the Trump administration has not clarified that. The Trump administration has said multiple things that contradict each other in terms of the objective. They have talked about regime change, but several officials, including Secretary of Defense Hegseth, Secretary of State / National Security Advisor Rubio, have openly said we are not into the nation-building game. We are not here to democratize. That raises the issue of what happens if the regime falls, which is a growing probability the farther this goes on. So could it last for weeks? It could. But there is also a scenario. And is it a 50-50% chance? I have no idea. I don't think anybody is able to really put anything that looks like a hard number on this. There is a plausible scenario whereby soon, in a matter of days, and maybe 1 week, I don't know, President Trump basically declares victory and says, we're done. We won. The Islamic Republic is significantly weaker. Its leaders are dead. Its military is in ruins, which is true. We will force it to come back to the negotiating table and extract humiliating concessions. We'll see about that one, but clearly Iran's bargaining position will have significantly decreased. And the logic here would be that Trump wouldn't want a weeks-long war that would cause major issues domestically for him, which really is the one thing that matters. Stock markets are already tumbling. Oil prices are rising, and they will rise more and far more the more this goes on. Within the MAGA pro-Trump coalition, there's an isolationist wing that is increasingly unhappy about what is going on. So how will Trump manage all of these domestic, political, and economic factors with the strategic endgame in Iran? I don't know. That's anybody's guess. But I do see that scenario where in the short term, he says, okay, we're done. We won. In terms of the last part of your question, the implications of this, that's where it's getting more difficult. Tactically, Israel and the U.S. are winning. And they're not just winning. They are completely dominating in terms of inflicting far more pain than they are suffering themselves. But strategically, this is where it gets really complicated. If this goes on and the regime falls, which is a growing possibility the longer this goes, what happens then? Is there an alternative to the Islamic Republic ready to take over? No, there's not. We might wish that there would be, but there simply is not. If this stops, as per my other scenario, and Trump declares victory, then the Islamic Republic survives, which throws under the bus the Iranian population that in the vast, vast majority of cases is completely fed up with this regime. They are thrown under the bus. That surviving Islamic Republic will be weaker, but it will be nastier. It will not be, a nicer version of the Islamic Republic. So that also has severe implications, not only domestically in Iran, but regionally as well.
Just this year, we witnessed U.S. strikes on Venezuela and the capture of President Maduro. We've seen talks of essentially the U.S. earlier talking about annexing Greenland, as well as the United States articulating that it seeks hemispheric dominance, essentially, and a focus on its own backyard. But this assassination marks the second time the U.S. has deposed a leader of a foreign country in just a few months. And this is after non-interventionism and isolationism arguably seem to be pillars of Trump's election campaign. So I'm wondering how, if at all, we can understand these recent strikes within the context of current U.S. foreign policy, and more broadly, what U.S. interests might be at play here.
Well, you're right to raise the contradiction. And this is not only an academic debate in terms of trying to figure out the Trump doctrine, but it's also a political issue for Trump domestically, like I said, and that needs to be emphasized. Trump is in the uncomfortable position of facing attacks from the far right, from the isolationist wing of his MAGA coalition. That, by the way, has interesting long-term implications, because one of the most prominent successors to lead the MAGA movement, the Republican Party, whatever you want to call it, after 2028, when Trump can't run again, is J.D. Vance. And J.D. Vance has long been openly and clearly opposed to endless wars, forever wars, entanglements in the Middle East, whatever you want to call them. Of course, Vance has repeatedly and regularly, very pragmatically changed his mind on multiple issues. One of the obvious ones being Trump himself, who he called Hitler just a few years ago, and now is more than happy to be his loyal vice president. So J.D. Vance has the mental flexibility to do the gymnastics to figure this out. But at the same time, it remains that there is a significant component of the MAGA coalition that is unhappy with this. So there is that element. in terms of American foreign policy under Trump, I don't think we can figure out a coherent doctrine for Trump. Even the Venezuela and Iran cases are extremely different. In Venezuela, they were in and out in 3 hours. They took away the president and left the number two in charge, and the rest of the system is still in place. In Iran, that is clearly not what is going on. One way that I like to think about how Trump is doing things, which is not a doctrine, because there's not enough substance or consistency to be able to figure something out. He blows things up, sometimes figuratively, as he's doing in American domestic politics, sometimes literally, as he's doing in Iran right now. He looks at where the pieces fall and then figures out how he can adapt to extract an advantage for himself. And by advantage for himself, I don't mean a strategic win for the U.S. geopolitically. I don't think he really cares about that. I mean a political advantage for himself, whereby he will be able to reframe the narrative in a way that makes him appear as the winner. That narrative that he'll reframe might be more or less connected to facts, but he will want to be able to emerge as a winner. And that, to me, is pretty much as far as I find I can go in terms of understanding or explaining his thinking.
It's not like you very generously refer to JD Vance as both pragmatic and flexible. Iran has partnerships and alliances, one could say, with China and Russia, both of whom have their own territorial ambitions. Sometimes we see the three lumped in together as this kind of set of revisionist autocratic powers that want to challenge Western values in the West. In your opinion, does the death of Khamenei impact the global balance of power at all, or alter dynamics between what we might call the West and authoritarian states, or those which seek to challenge, the so-called Western-led rules-based order?
The answer to that so far is no, in the sense that the Islamic Republic survives for now. And as long as it survives, it remains the Islamic Republic. It remains opposed to the U.S. It remains a revisionist power that wants to challenge American interests in the region, including Saudi and Israeli interests, because they are partnering with the U.S. And it remains more or less aligned with China and Russia. I think the interesting point to make about China and Russia is to realize that they are right now not doing much to help Iran. And that is really a key point. This highlights the limits of their power. They do not have the military power to compete with the U.S. in the Middle East right now. China and Russia could not save Iran even if they wanted to. The issue, though, is that they don't want to. And this, by the way, is an argument you could have made about Venezuela as well, right? Which was their one of their close partners in South and Latin America. From China and Russia's perspective, yes, they're close to Iran. That's absolutely true. They've sold weapons to Iran, and I expect that they might actually ramp up a bit their weapon sales to Iran in the coming weeks and months, and perhaps years if the Islamic Republic survives that long. But that won't be a game changer. Russia and China are close to Iran, but Iran is a difficult partner for them, and we can't emphasize that enough. Iran is not an ideal partner for them, and they know that. Russia and China are also close to Saudi Arabia and the UAE. Saudi Arabia and the UAE are actually more valuable partners. They're more predictable. They're more useful. They're wealthier countries than Iran. And so if China or Russia or both really started ramping up support for Iran right now, that would not only precipitate them into a confrontation with the U.S., which they do not want, but it would also cost them in terms of their equally, if not somewhat more important relations with the UAE and Saudi Arabia, which are very valuable to them. And they do not want to do that. So that's why you're basically seeing, a fairly aggressive critical statements coming out of Russia and China, putting aside the irony of Vladimir Putin criticizing the violation of international law by the U.S. by attacking a sovereign country. There's a certain irony to that. But these are only words, right? Actions are not following.
Prime Minister Carney's official statement expressed support initially for U.S. actions to prevent Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon and to prevent the regime from further threatening international peace and security. I'm kind of quoting that announcement from a few days ago. Although yesterday, after some controversy over that statement, Carney kind of walked back that support a little bit and was a bit more critical of U.S. and Israel. What do you make of the Canadian response? Do you read it as diplomatic, supportive, pragmatic, or maybe muted? And would you be able to analyze the messaging or position, particularly in light of tensions in the bilateral relationship since the beginning of Trump 2.0? And furthermore, maybe within the context of Carney's big Davos speech, which has been talked about a lot since Davos, which outlined what's called the Carney Doctrine, this kind of apparently pragmatic, realistic lens and the need to offset the disproportionate power of the big powers and diversify alliances and establish new ones, variable geometry, as he calls it. Some people have called that speech at Davos realistic and clear-eyed, but also kind of a not so thinly veiled criticism of the U.S. under Trump and the big powers and how they undermine the so-called rules-based order when it's convenient. So, I mean, rambling a little bit there, sorry, but how could the statement on Iran be understood within that framework and within the context of our relationship?
So,
if at all.
Several points to make on all of that. First of all, in a very Canadian way, I find that we're spending way too much time arguing about words and not about actual substance or action. Whatever position Canada takes on the U.S.-Israeli war on Iran, it's only rhetoric. We are not going to do anything about it. We are not going to join the war. In support. We are not going to do anything, obviously, in opposition. And there's nothing that we can realistically do or say that will have any impact on what the U.S. or Israel, for that matter, or Iran are actually doing, right? So it's only words, and they have a limited impact. Point number one. Point number two, the main audience, to me, when Carney came out more or less in support of the war in early days, with some of the nuances, adjustments, recalibration, whatever you want to call them, that were brought later on, the audience was President Trump. Right. The point was to signal to President Trump that Canada was not opposing him. And the logic here, I have to assume, even though this is speculation, is at a time of critical vulnerability on the Canadian side, when not only we are about to renegotiate our free trade deal with the U.S., but multiple other security, defense, trade arrangements with the U.S. are at play, where Trump has clearly shown that he is not afraid to bully and push around Canada, given how extremely vulnerable we are to that. I have to assume that part of the calculus here, and a significant part of the calculus, was we can't afford to annoy Trump, to irritate and anger Trump, and to get him to hold a grudge against us. Now, what is essential to understand here is that by taking that position, does Canada actually gain anything with Trump? No. Right? You don't buy capital with Trump like that. That is simply not how it works. Does it mean that it's pointless? No, because even if it's difficult to win points with Trump, you can lose points with Trump. So to me, if Canada had taken the position that, for example, Spain has been so vocally taking, or even something a bit more nuanced of openly opposing Trump, stating the obvious in terms of the illegality of the war and so on, then you really risk angering Trump and losing something. And the comparison with Spain is important because unlike Spain, we are a direct neighbor of the U.S. Unlike Spain, we are not sheltered by the EU, the European Union, right? So Spain has a luxury, a certain comfort in doing this that we don't have. So by and large, that's how I'm reading it. Last point on Davos. Again, I find that the Davos speech has been attracting a bit too much attention. It's an important speech. It laid out principles. These principles contradict each other. You can either view that as criticism, as an incoherent speech, or you can view that as no. The point of the speech is that the world is complicated and dangerous, and there is not, one principle or one set of coherent principles that explains it and guides our answer. So the point is that, yes, these principles contradict each other, but agile foreign policy must be able to pick and choose on a case-by-case basis what matters more, leaning a bit more on values, leaning a bit more on realism. That's how I read the speech. I know that because it was general enough, a lot of people have been able to project onto the speech what they wanted to hear, and then that's part of the issue, part of the reason why we're having so much debate on this. But I find that ultimately, Canadians have been very flattered that so many people around the world are talking about the speech by Canadian Prime Minister. Our Canadian ego was flattered by all of that. That's amazing. But to really understand what you referred to as the Carney Doctrine, I find that it's more useful to look at what he's actually been doing as opposed to rhetoric.
Well, thank you, Dr. Juneau. You've been great, as always. Before we wrap up this episode, I'm wondering if you can maybe provide any last thoughts about the conversation we've had. Maybe we've missed something in our line of questioning. And maybe building on that, maybe, what's something that our audience listening could really take away or should take away from this discussion or the events in Iran of the past week?
There's a lot of different things that I could mention in answer to that. I would come back to a point we mentioned earlier in the conversation that really deserves a lot of attention. The U.S. is engaged in a war with a country of 90 million people at the heart of the Middle East that is extremely heavily armed with absolutely no clear end goal. And that, to me, is mind-boggling, and we are not saying this enough. To emphasize, the Islamic Republic is a massive human rights violator. It is in power now because it killed in January thousands and maybe tens of thousands of its own people. It is an exporter of terror. It is a major source of instability in the Middle East. All of that is true. All of that calls for the need to do something about it. But there are good ways and bad ways to do something about it. And right now we're in a scenario where the regime could fall. Not this week. I don't think so. Keeping in mind, again, that we're all very bad at predicting when regimes collapse or not, but I still think that the regime has a good degree of resilience. But if this goes on for weeks, this regime could or will fall. What comes next? How is this not a situation where it is followed by civil war, where it is followed by prolonged instability? This is the nightmare scenario for Iran's neighbors, and that's why they were hesitant to support the war, if not openly opposed, before this weekend. It is obviously and clearly, and this has to be said, a nightmare scenario for the Iranian people, who have already been suffering for 47 years under an absolutely brutal regime. And when I listen to U.S. leaders, President Trump, Secretaries Hegseth or Rubio, talking over the past few days, there is absolutely no indication of a plan. They constantly contradict each other. They constantly change their tune from day to day, from hour to hour in some cases. And this would be cartoonish if it were not about a country of 90 million people, with the possibility of a massive humanitarian catastrophe and a huge security vacuum that could last for a long time. And it just boggles my mind that there is no indication of clear thinking about where this could be going beyond the very real need to do something about the Islamic Republic and beyond the very reality of strong tactical gains by the U.S. and Israel. What happens next?
Thanks for your analysis today, Dr. Juneau, and for helping us understand these latest events in Iran. We always appreciate when you come on the podcast. I also have the Ottawa Conference 2026 agenda up on my laptop here, and I see that you'll be actually being involved in a fireside chat with Mr. Gordon Venner later this afternoon. So I want to thank you for your continued engagement with the Institute, and I hope you enjoy the conference later today.
Thanks for inviting me to both.
Thanks so much. Take care.
You too.
And that's all for today's episode. The Expert Series is released every Tuesday. If you want to learn more about the CDA Institute, follow us on social media, visit our website at cdainstitute.ca, or subscribe to our newsletter for the latest updates on Canadian defense and international security. If you have comments or feedback about what you heard in today's edition, email josh@cdainstitute.ca. I'm Josh Malm. Until next time.